So here we go. I'm going to talk to you briefly about poetry, and it's actually a great pleasure to do so because poetry is an art form which relies on the creative artist's creative imagination, and as such, it's a bit like going to a museum together and pointing out this picture or that painting or this sculpture and talking about what you like and what you observe and what you think the artist is trying to do, and perhaps interpreting how this or that line or this form, this color might add to the overall meaning. That's generally the sort of the analytical model which we use when you get a little older. You think of poetry like art, with a great deal of respect and reverence, and enjoyment. Above all, enjoyment, because you go to the museum down in Washington, people exiting the museum, you'll notice, are not in a lot of stress, or they're not overly anxious about whether they got those pictures right. They went in there to be enriched and to enjoy themselves, and that's pretty much the way you should look at any creative art, it seems to me. It is true that if you become an English major or graduate student or whatever, you're going to get quite intense about your literary analysis, but the truth is that poetry is an art form, and therefore should be read for enjoyment and enrichment. Why is art interesting? Why is art enriching? Well, without getting too deep or profound or extensive in my answer, I would simply say that the arts issue or spring out of the creative imagination, and because of that, the form that the art assumes is nonlinear. That is, it's an organic form for the most part, which doesn't abide by or obey conventional rules. In fact, poetry, even though of course we do have formal expectations for any different type of poem, either in terms of its line or its stanzaic structure, the fact of the matter is that the delight that we have, the joy that we have in poetry, is not in its obedience to form, but rather in its disobedience. In other words, it's the variations, it's the things, it's the unexpected, the unpredictable, the random, the chaotic, the organic explosion that occurs in poetry that we live for and love. And that, of course, is why the poet is writing as well. So you can think of it a bit like, I always like to think about Shakespeare writing his sonnets because he's such a genius at that. It's a bit like playing tennis without a net or without boundary lines, without the lines around the court. You need the lines around the court, and you need the sonnet form, but the object of the game is to hit the ball so hard or so cleverly that the opponent can't get to it. And that's kind of the same thing in writing poetry. The object is to shoot a meteor out beyond the boundaries so that the reader stands in awe of it. Anyway, it's a creative art, and its joy lies in its expansive, explosive properties. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, it means that poetry in the old days, which was largely narrative, that is, it told stories, and did so, I might add, mnemonically, that is, all the rhyme and the musical qualities that we associate with ancient epic narrative poetry was there because they didn't have writing, and these stories were being told literally through music. They were actually being sung, and so that the rhyme would enable you to remember what you heard, and it would also, of course, make the rendering more memorable. We still have rhyme in poetry, but we don't feel as poets obliged to use rhyme. Rhyme is there as a musical quality to help. So what this means is that poetry changed. We stopped singing it, and it became this thing on a page. In fact, Lots of poetry that we see in textbooks and poetry books you never read them out loud. You pick up a New Yorker and you see some crazy poem in there, and you're not going to read that thing out loud. What is that thing on a page? Well, that's a good question. Poetry as an art form has become almost a visual phenomenon, and some modern poets, of course, take great pleasure in the structure of the poem and trying to make it visually arresting. But again, the point here is simple. In the old days, poetry was written as a way of telling stories, as a way of thinking about deep, profound issues like love and loss, life and death, and that sort of thing. Poetry in the modern times changed. It became what we call lyrical. That is to say, it became poetry of the spirit. It's poetry of the intense longing for experience that will transport us, if not out of this world, at least to a place where the meaning of this world acquires something like the transcendent. So much of modern poetry has an intense quality. Lyrical is a word which originally, again, means musical, because the lyre, L-Y-R-E, meant the musical instrument, for example, that David in biblical Old Testament played. Technically a Greek term, I think. But anyway, so lyrical means musical, but in fact, as I say, in modern usage, lyrical has, while it may still include musical qualities, doesn't have to, but while it does, while it may include musicality, what lyrical really means today is intense. It really means it's language that is characterized by a certain intensity or sensibility, that is a sense of intense feeling. And it's usually language, in my opinion, that calls attention to itself as language. In other words, the phrasing, the word choice is such that the language is memorable and is elevated above the normal, common everyday language. So there is something amazing about lyrical language. And in my opinion, the greatest lyrical poet ever was William Butler Yeats, who was an Irish poet. But the important thing, again, is that the word lyrical means intense, either in feeling or expression, I guess would be the best definition. My sense is that the expression is every bit as important as the sensibility behind it. So, as I say, while once we wrote ballads, sad songs about lovers, losing lovers and losing lives and things like the ship's going down and all that kind of stuff. That's what the old ballads were all about. Heroic epics. That narrative function gave way to what we call the lyrical, which is largely a way of expressing some intense feeling or sensibility. It's not that the lyric and the narrative are completely divorced, because they're not, because many modern poems, in fact, I would argue all of them in one way or another, convey a sense of story. But the narrative element is definitely in the background in modern lyric. Okay, so enough of that. I went on a little longer than I wanted to there, but that's okay, because it's important for you to get comfortable and relaxed about this sort of background sense that we have. Now, what do we do when we write about poetry, when we read poetry? Well, as adults, the best way to do it is to approach it as if you were in a poetry writing class yourself, which means if you were reading, for example, my poem, you would say, "Wow, this is an interesting poem. I think what the writer here is trying to say is, or trying to do," and you sort of give a general feeling or impression of what you think the poem is up to, and then you begin to explore the poem so as to substantiate or explore whether or not what you said is accurate. And in doing so, you tend to discover details with greater degrees of specificity. So, for example, the first level of observation might be the structure or the story, or the kind of the argument of the poem. Or perhaps there's a central metaphor that dominates the poem, or a central image, and you'll comment on that. A symbol, perhaps. And then you'll move into some of the more interesting details, whether they be a line that has a particular musical quality or a particularly well phrased notion, or maybe just one word, or some rhyming or internal rhyming, external end rhyming, whatever. So in other words, you go from the general to the specific. And I pointed this out in an announcement earlier. And that progression, you see, is very comfortable, it's very natural, it's very relaxed, very conversational even. And as a result, what you'll do is you'll either prove your thesis or you'll explore it, and explore its usefulness or accuracy. As such, the discussion is a sort of activity of discovery, as well as proof in the traditional sense of argument. So there you have it. That's pretty much a good summary, it seems to me, of what we do now. I could talk about romantic and real, but we'll do that later. Let me just move on here, and this is an introductory exercise. I have an assignment here at the end for you to embark on. It's not too difficult for you. It's introductory, purposefully so. So I'm going to go ahead and read to you several poems and talk to you about them, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Again, remember, we're in a museum now, and we're looking at paintings, and we're not testing ourselves. What we're doing is we're just enjoying ourselves and finding out what we as readers get from these things. That's sort of the point. That's the new way of thinking about poetry, and I think it's the preferred way. Okay, this next slide has this poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay, a truly delightful poet. I chose this because it actually speaks to what we were just saying, which I thought was kind of awesome. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it to you. Just 2 seconds here, not much time to be spent on here, really just for fun, because it reinforces what was just being said. I will put chaos into 14 lines. This is a 14-line sonnet, by the way. It's called an Italian sonnet, not important. It's got an 8-line and a 6-line sort of structure. The first 8 lines are called the octet, and the second called the sestet. The Italian sonnet form, it's sort of loose and frankly chaotic relative compared, say, to the Shakespearean sonnet, or what's also called the Elizabethan sonnet, which has 3 quatrains, that is 3 4-line stanzas with a couplet at the end, that is 2 rhyming lines at the end. The Italian sonnet is much less sort of mathematically precise. The Italian sonnet has a kind of, well, Italianate flourish. It's free and celebrates expressive, feminine rhyme, feminine endings, expressiveness. Well, Edna St. Vincent Millay has this wonderful thing to say, and she's just hysterical, and she is, to me, the archetypal poet, because she loves the chaotic nature of the creative imagination. So here we go. I'm just going to read it. I'm not going to say much more about it because it speaks for itself, I think, very well. I'll say a little bit. I need to define a couple of words. I will put chaos into 14 lines and keep him there, and let him thence escape if he be lucky. Let him twist and ape flood, fire, and demon. His adroit designs will strain to nothing in the strict confines of this sweet order, where, in pious rape, I hold his essence and amorphous shape, till he with order mingles and combines. Past are the hours, the years of our duress, his arrogance, our awful servitude. I have him. He is nothing more or less than something simple, not yet understood. I shall not even force him to confess or answer. I will only make him good. You see, it's such a wonderful poem. I can barely resist blabbing away for hours about it, but I will just say quickly that, of course, chaos and order do a kind of dance, and they've been doing it since the ancient Greeks, and only in modern times have scientists in what was called the chaos theory back in, I think, the 80s, discovered and proved even that chaos, or what we think of as pure randomness, is actually embedded with, or programmed, you might say, with encoded order, principles of order, so that when you see a random array of numbers, for example, on a computer fractal, those computer fractals bear out that there are encoded patterns of symmetry and order and harmony, however ragged they might be, so that chaos has within it order. So you might say that order has within it chaos as well. It's kind of the organic outflowing of the creation, which Henry David Thoreau, our great American writer, wrote about at length in his Walden. There's something wonderful and formless, or amorphous, to use her word, about chaos, and yet that amorphous or organic movement or flow yields, as does the poet's imagination, highly refined and beautiful patterns of order. Now, what she's referring to, of course, here is a relationship with a lover, because you don't know her probably, but that's what she writes about a lot. And it's she has a great sense of humor and whimsy, as you can tell from this poem, and she suggests that she's going to capture this mate, or this lover, and imprison him in, if not her sonnet, at least in her own clutches, where he will not be able to escape. And so it's just a beautiful little paean to not only to the lover relationship, but also to poetry and all of the creative arts. It's quite wonderful. So I want to, I know you can read this as well as I can. The word adroit, on line 4, I just want to point out, means deft and able and agile, and so you can read Chaos's adroit designs. His own designs will strain to nothing in the strict confines of this sweet order. He won't be able to move in this 14-line sonnet form, where in pious rape, in other words, she will actually devour him, or her poem will, in piety meaning goodness. Piety is is an old word relating to religious or spiritual righteousness or goodness. So a little oxymoron there, a little pious rape, a little contradiction in terms. But I'm going to encage or enclose chaos within my form, and thus rape him, but do it for his own good, and do it for the good, you see. In pious rape. And see, it's a wonderful reference really to the relationship, but the sort of the Dionysian relationship, that is the relationship that's with all of the tensions between a man and a woman. So she says, I'm going to, in pious rape, I will hold his essence and amorphous shape. The word amorphous means without shape or formless. Again, a contradiction. I hold his essence and amorphous, that is, away from shape or form, shape, till he with order mingles and combines. Past are the hours, the years of our duress, his arrogance, our awful servitude. In other words, those days are gone. He's not in charge now, I am. I have him. He is nothing, more or less, than something simple, not yet understood. I shall not even force him to confess or answer. I will only make him good. Isn't that just the most delightful thing? Anyway, I just thought it'd be fun for you to see that, because it's kind of in keeping with what we were saying about the nature of poetry, the joy and the delight in poetry of of the chaotic, or the impulse to explode beyond the boundaries of order. Okay? Perfect poem for us. All right, good. I'm stopping now. Next slide. Alfred Lloyd Tennyson's Break, Break, Break is a perfect poem just for another introductory sort of poem, because his sense of rhythm is so amazing, his sense of music. It reminds us of the old ballads and the long ago, the narratives of loss and lost youth. He often writes about lost youth. But he also has this very sort of modern, lyrical intensity, which is wonderful. He is, in my opinion, what makes him great and enduring is this sort of modern intensity of language. I'll show you what I mean. I'll just read it. Break, break, break on thy cold gray stones, O sea, and I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. Oh, well for the fisherman's boy that he shouts with his sister at play. Oh, well for the sailor lad that he sings in his boat on the bay. And the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is still. Break, break, break at the foot of thy crags, O sea, but the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me. So you see, what Tennyson is saying in this poem, it seems to me, is that poetry is a way of saying that which cannot be said. Because in fact, that's what he's saying. He's saying, I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. And then he goes on basically to write a poem which effectively, through its music and its intensity and its sensibility, does that. This is a poem that actually says what the poet himself says cannot be said. So that is probably a pretty good definition. As a matter of fact, I think I've heard that somewhere. Poetry can be defined as language that says that which cannot be said. But anyway, you get the idea. I think it's a perfect introductory piece because of the musicality of the rhythm and the deep and sense of loss. And in this case, it's lost youth, lost innocence perhaps, but certainly a lost love as well. And the fact that none of that is expressed clearly, so we don't actually know the details, makes it even all the more powerful. Because that is in fact the nature of loss, and it's the nature of our dealing with it. It is a sort of oceanic sense, a kind of formless void into which we file loss, and we all carry around us this sense of loss. And the old balladeers and the narratives of the old days, with their understatement and their omission, these huge gashings of factual details, seem to say better than any other way could say our own sense of loss. And Tennyson's simply doing the same thing here with, as I say, a kind of modern lyrical intensity. He's wonderful, wonderful poet. This next poem, Dulce et Decorum Est, was written by a very sad person, Wilfred Owen. You see his picture there and a copy of his original manuscript from 1917. Wilfred Owen actually died recently, soon after writing this poem. This is one of the great World War I poems. These boys who were thrust into World War I were had no idea what they were getting into. They ended up embroiled in an international conflict, and unlike previous wars, were not defending their own homeland. They actually were in some foreign land shooting some anonymous enemy, some faceless anonymous enemy. Not only that, but they confronted bombs and gas, biological warfare, and these shells, these horrible shells. So machine guns. It was a warfare on a scale that no one had ever seen before. And these provincial boys who were not, they came from the countryside and they weren't sophisticated. They might have even had romantic notions about what war would be like. So anyway, it was a terrible war and terribly disillusioning for them, and they died by the thousands. Wilfred Owen depicts in this poem the horror of that. And what's so striking about this poem, aside from the beauty of the poem itself, which of course is the main thing, what's so striking about this poem is that he actually foresaw his own death, at least so it seems. People do foresee their own deaths. They often record in their dream journals or tell people about a dream they've had, and their actual death shortly thereafter will be eerily similar to what they dreamed. This poem actually depicts something like prescience. That is, he's referencing a dream that he has that foretells the future, and he describes it as if it were some kind of psychic event occurring in some green sea, which is a pretty apt description of a psychic realm. Anyway, without getting too spooky, it is a spooky idea that he's actually describing himself here, unconsciously probably. But anyway, I'll go ahead and read the poem to you. The purpose of the poem being included in this selection of poetry is so that you can explore irony. The central irony in this poem is so remarkable because the central irony is centrally related to the theme of the poem. So that, in other words, the core meaning of this poem is intimately associated with this central irony. So it's very simple. It's a great poem, for example, to teach to young high school boys in particular, because they all tend to romanticize war. So anyway, I'll go ahead and read the poem to you now and then discuss it real briefly. It goes like this. Dulce et decorum est. Dulce et decorum est, by the way, is a Latin phrase meaning it is sweet and becoming to die for one's country. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and becoming to die for one's country. In other words, a death noble and a death to be desired. Bent double, like old beggars, under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of disappointed shells that dropped behind. Gas, gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face,
like a devil's, sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patriae more. And there you see his manuscript. So, and then he dies shortly thereafter in a way remarkably similar to what he's described here. So it's a very sad and very spooky, not spooky, it's just very sad. But I think what's so compelling about the poem, at least right now for our purposes, is the two things. One is the irony. The last two lines, the old lie, you could rewrite the old irony that it is not, in fact, sweet and becoming to die for one's country. It might be noble, and it might be a worthy sacrifice, and it might be a necessary sacrifice, but it's not sweet. It's not pretty, and it sure as hell isn't romantic. So, the other thing I think that's so noticeable in this poem is the imagery of the goggles. He says, floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. I just think that's such beautiful language. And of course he's describing the goggles or the panes of the gas masks that they wore, these thick goggles on them. But that thick green sea, which he's likening the goggles and the gas in combination to, is actually in turn likened to a psychic realm where we see things as if in an eerie altered state. And sure enough, we even see something like the future. It's a beautiful moment of detachment that approaches the mystical. And of course, the word misty has a subtle secondary connotation or association, at least in sound association, with mystical, which is not lost on us because he's already mentioned a kind of ecstasy of fumbling. So there's this strange, horrible, almost sinister, and yet somehow sense of ecstasy or detachment, something like an intermediate state between this world and the next, a kind of prescience, actually, of death and in dying. Anyway, it's a wonderful and profoundly beautiful poem as a poem. So anyway, I'm going to stop here and move on to the next slide. Okay, just remember, irony is important. Why is it ironic? Well, because this is something we say, but in fact it's not the truth.
This next poem is another sonnet, actually. It's a 14-line poem. It's also an Italian sonnet, which the Romantics were very fond of. Percy Bysshe Shelley was one of the three great British Romantics of the 19th century. This poem is one that he wrote when he heard about, we think, the discovery of Ramses II's ruins. Ramses was the Greek name for Ramses, the Egyptian pharaoh, was Ozymandias, we learned later. So Shelley, in this sonnet, writes about the irony of temporal or worldly power, the way that we who are in power, and we all in some way or another delude ourselves into thinking that we are in power. But the irony is that we're not. We're all powerless, and if we don't believe it, we just need to stick around a while and we'll find out just how powerless we really are. And that's kind of the point of the poem. it's really a universal human condition that Shelley is addressing here, and that is this incipient pride that we have in our hearts that tells us that we're going to be here for a long, long time, when in fact we're going to be here for a very, very short time. We may exist in some other form, but that's not what Shelley's talking about. What he's talking about is our illusions of power are truly delusional. So the irony, of course, is that we don't get that. We have opportunities to learn it over and over again, but we don't seem to learn it. So anyway, I want to read this poem and let you enjoy how Shelley deals with this central irony of the human heart, because that's directly what he's writing about. Ozymandias. Oh, one cool thing about this poem I've got to tell you is that it seems layered. He speaks right at the beginning of meeting a traveler who in turn tells him about something which he had seen, which in turn has a message to convey. And the message is ironic. It doesn't convey what is intended, that is. But you'll notice that there's this layering, like sands in a desert, which suggests a number of things. One, it suggests that this has been going on since the beginning of time, and it will probably continue to go on. But it also suggests that the message, the communications that we have to truths are often attenuated, that is, filtered through time in shadowy, misty ways, like the poem we just read. So anyway, let's read this. Another way of saying that, by the way, is that the truths that we see and know to be true can be quite decomposed, and yet they still remain true with great clarity and resonance, as this poem will attest. So Ozymandias, let's read it. I met a traveler from an antique land. That's an ancient land, not a place where they sell antiques, of course. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So you see, a just absolutely lovely poem. Shelley is, of course, saying that we think we're powerful, but we're not, and it's just that simple. And we think we're powerful even when we don't want to. But that's not what he's saying, but that is, well, in a way it is what he's saying, because he's saying that this reality of the human heart persists throughout all time, it seems, like an ancient message. Well, anyway, an ancient message encoded in irony, you might say. So here you have this bolded language, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. Now that's ironic. Why is it ironic? Well, in a couple of ways it's ironic. The obvious way is that Ozymandias, who's had this inscribed on the pedestal, thinks that he is the mightiest of all, and he claims that people who see his works should despair because they can never hope to achieve anything like he has. So the words that when he says, "Look on my works, ye mighty," and despair, the word mighty there could be taken to be sarcasm, ironic sarcasm, as if he's sneering and taunting whoever might visit his land, who might think they're mighty. So he's using the word mighty as sarcastic. It could also be that he's actually referring to the mighty, though, but those who are mighty, but whose might doesn't even approach his. In any event, the central irony in this poem is that he thinks that he's mighty and therefore others should despair because they'll never hope to achieve it. But in truth, what the poet is saying, or what the poem, I should say, is saying, is that we should in fact despair, but not because of why Ozymandias thinks we should despair. We should despair because this pride in the human heart persists and survives through all time, apparently, into all individuals. That's why we should despair, because what we're seeing, of course, is a record of the human heart's persistence. So let me just go over one more thing here in this poem, and then we'll stop. Let's go back to the beginning here. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies." The word visage or visage means face, and whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command convey, that is, communicate that its sculptor, that is, the artist who created the statue, well those passions read those passions accurately, which yet survive. In other words, the passions, namely pride, survive to this day. And here's what's interesting grammatically. It's a little bit of a bump in the road here grammatically, but it's pretty clever what Shelley's doing. He says, which yet survive. You could say that that's an intransitive complete verb, i.e. there's no object. So he says, well those passions read which yet survive, even, you might add, to this day. And then he says, stamped on these lifeless things, that is, those passions, the pride being stamped and depicted accurately on these lifeless things. But these passions survive the hand that mocked them, that is, the artist's hand, the artist being long dead now, and the heart that fed. And that, of course, is the heart of Ozymandias. So what the poet is saying is that let's go back, the frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command convey that the sculptor, the artist, read that pride accurately because he depicted, or she depicted, the passion accurately on these lifeless things, and these passions also survive the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. So it's not just the art that survives, but it's what's stamped on the human heart. That's the idea here. That's why I think he sort of bifurcates that grammar for us to think that yes, the image of the pride remains and survives those times, but also the image of the pride lives on stamped on the human heart. Okay? So anyway, and one more final word I must say. The last 3 lines of the poem, nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Now, that language, if you broke it down, which we're not going to do right now, but if we did, musically, you would be amazed at how wonderful at the linguistic level Shelley has manipulated the language to effect or evoke the very thing that he's talking about. The entire last 3 lines are nothing but a beautiful onomatopoeia or phonetic intensive. That is to say, the sound of the lines evoke or suggest or approximate the very things that he's talking about. In this case, a kind of timeless attenuation, not so much in diminishment, but there is a diminishment, but not so much in the essence of the thing. So what a beautiful metaphor for this notion that he has, that in time, while things decay and fall into dust, the essence of the human heart, the pride of the human heart, lives on as clearly and as undisturbed as anything could. Just phenomenal stuff. He communicates this, as I say, through the music by evoking this sense of distance and decay. I probably have overtalked this thing, and I apologize, but I just am so excited about the alliteration and the internal rhyme and the onomatopoeia. The music of those last three lines are just amazing, which frankly are why Shelley is the great poet that he is, in my opinion. He's one of the three great romantics, the other two being Wordsworth and Keats. But anyway, I can't. I have to stop now. I could really get into that music, but we'll talk about it later. All right, then that's that. So that's enough. I'm going to stop. We'll move on to the next slide, and that'll be it. Hold on. Okay, the last poem that we're going to read together is Richard Cory by Edward Arlington Robinson, who was a wonderful writer in the early 20th century. He sort of, like a lot of people in that era, often referred to, I think, as the Edwardian era or the end of the Edwardian era, had kind of one foot in the old ways of the gentleman, the Victorian gentleman, and another foot in this modern 20th century. So there's a sense of straddling the fence, of ambivalence about where exactly do you stand. Richard Cory had this wonderful rhythmic cadence in his poetry that seems to be like a pendulum swinging back and forth between the romantic and the real. In that way, he's a little bit like Robert Frost, who came much later, of course, but there is this ambivalence about whether you're a romantic or a realist. The realist is the one who says, you may have dreams, but they don't come true and they don't count. And sometimes they're even dangerous in the real world. So anyway, Edward Arlington Robinson, I believe, was a romantic at heart, but felt that, to be honest, you had to realize that the old ways were gone, and the new modern world, with the industrialization of the modern world emerging, life became somewhat brutal. So, and if you weren't able to adapt to the new world, you were going to be lost. And that's kind of what this poem is getting at, I think. But the most important thing for our purposes is that irony is the main means by which that whatever thematic content in the poem you decide the poem has, by which that is communicated or conveyed. So let's read the poem. It's a wonderful poem, a famous old favorite. It's called Richard Cory. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said good morning, and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat, and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. Now, you see, it's the realist's job to put a bullet through the head of the romantic, you might say. When we read this poem, Richard Cory is not just an elevated royal imperial sort. It is as if he is a visitor from another time, namely a time gone by, and just recently gone by, you see. He is a Victorian gentleman, and he's out of time now, he's out of place. So let's read it, thinking about it that way. Obviously, the irony in the poem is that we thought Richard Cory had everything that we wanted. It turns out that he didn't. In fact, we probably had what he wanted. You can decide what that all might mean, but of course, it's quite obvious that there is a sense that wealth and even royalty don't give us what we really want. What we really want is internal and spiritual, and yet we struggle for that which is material and external. That's the basic theme, of course, of the poem, but within the context of the cultural reading of it, it's quite interesting. So let's read it a little bit. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, now the word down, of course, subliminally suggests beneath him. So already, through the use of connotation, the poet is communicating his idea. Connotation is simply a word meaning a secondary word association that words have. In other words, words have associative properties that aren't necessarily in the dictionary, and they may even reside in our subconscious. But like, for example, here, the word down, it doesn't mean anything relating to societal nobility or anything like that, or the lack of it. But the word itself, used here, does have, on the subconscious level, a kind of a connotation of people being beneath Richard Cory. He does it again in the next line. Look, whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. The word pavement is just a word meaning pavement. But here, in this context, it has the connotation of people on the street, or the pedestrians who are beneath somehow the royalty. So he says, whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. What does that mean, looked at him? Why is that significant? Well, in good realist tradition, by not saying anything else, the poet suggests that they look at him with reverence and even awe. In some ways, by not saying anything at all, he leaves open the possibility of something much greater. That is to say, we look at him as if he's divine. That's what the poem will begin to say. He was a gentleman from soul to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. So the word gentleman there, you see, doesn't just mean he's a nice guy. It means he's well-to-do, he's high-bred, he's well-bred, and he also comes from another time, another era, when there were, in fact, gentlemen and common people. That's what he's referring to here. He's part of a bygone era. He was a gentleman from soul to crown. Of course, the word soul is a play on the word S-O-U-L, and crown meaning royal crown, and perhaps even religious crown as well, spiritual significance. So the idea being that that Richard Cory is being built up here as a person who has both material and spiritual properties that we would envy. Clean-favored and imperially slim, and he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked, as if the expectation is that he wasn't human at all, as if on some level we don't even think of him as human, so that we're almost surprised when he does talk. Also, look at the word arrayed, another word which has an interesting, subtle connotation. The word arrayed, of course, means dressed, but it contains within it that word ray, which suggests light, which again suggests that Richard Cory is walking along in some celestial light or radiance. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked, as if we have on some level an expectation that he wouldn't even talk like a human. But still, he fluttered pulses when he said good morning, and he glittered when he walked, as though we're surprised that he can even interact with the world of the normal world in such a way as to flutter pulses. If you look at the word flutter and glitter, those are two words which, aside from being phonetically interesting, that is, they sound like what they mean on some level of mind, but they also suggest something like some bird-like realm or some celestial realm that isn't even human. But that's a very linguistic and a very subtle association that we have. Fluttered and glittered are what we call onomatopoeia or phonetic intensities, because the sound of them somehow evokes what they're talking about, what they're actually mean. So anyway, that again, these details of analysis that I'm sharing with you are not necessarily what I would expect you to communicate in your paper or anything like that, but I'm just sharing with you for fun. So anyway, go on. And he was rich. Yes, richer than a king. Of course, his name is Richard, but we'll drop that. And admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, of course, the word fine suggests refinement. In those days, they could say in fine, meaning in some. In fine, we thought that he was everything to make us wish that we were in his place. And here comes the irony. So on we worked and waited for the light. And of course, the word light meaning the light, not physical light, although I suppose if you're in poverty, you may not have light, but it also means, of course, religious light. It has spiritual connotations, and also the light of purpose and the light of resolution and hope. And went without the meat and cursed the bread. So somehow we associate our resolution, our redemption, our joy, our solution to life with material goods, with material wealth. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. So you see what Robinson is doing here is he's suggesting that as we move into this modern age with our mad collective obsession for wealth and material prosperity, and if we don't have, we think we're in the darkness somehow. We really lose something of the old days, something much more important than wealth, and something much more important than some kind of system of gentlemen and ladies. We lose something romantic, whereby we understand that there's more to life than material wealth. So there's some very interesting, subtle irony going on here. It isn't just that Richard Cory was out of time and was out of his element because he was a gentleman. It's also that in those days, we didn't necessarily associate our salvation with material wealth. In those days, you were born into whatever wealth you had, and to a large extent, you weren't able to improve your lot as you can in the modern world. But at the same time, and in part because of that, you didn't associate your personal happiness with your ability to acquire wealth for yourself. So that may be the real irony, that we in the modern world don't even read this poem properly. We sit around thinking Richard Cory is just a sad person from the Victorian era, when in fact it's we who are the sad people, perhaps. Very interesting reading, I must say, if I do say so myself. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. But again, we're in a museum and we're just wandering through, looking at art, and we're sharing it and enjoying it. The real purpose here is for us to enjoy this material thematically, to the extent that we analyze it, to enhance that thematic appreciation, as I hope I've just demonstrated for you. It's all for the good. It's all better. So I'm going to Now I'm simply going to read the assignment with you, which is the next slide, and then we'll be done. Okay? Thank you. Enjoyed it. Okay. The assignment generated from this discussion is as follows. It's a fairly, I think, pleasurable assignment for you. I hope it is. Reading for your next essay, number 3, pick one or two of the poems just read and discuss them thematically by answering one of the following. 1. Are they thematically similar to one of the short stories you have read? Discuss not only their meaning, what the works say or convey, but also how their respective writers convey, develop, suggest, or explore their themes, whether through story, structure, character, style, symbol, irony, and the like, just as we've been doing in this discussion. Or, number 2, in the alternative, if you prefer not to focus on a technical literary analysis, but rather on the development of your own ideas, that is, fine. You may limit your discussion of the literature to a simple thematic summary, and then discuss with thoughtful consideration your own ideas regarding the theme you have chosen as you perceive it. For example, you may wish to discuss how we in our culture tend to confuse material wealth with spiritual fulfillment and happiness until a Richard Cory or some devastating experience comes our way and awakens us to the error of our ways, making us appreciate what we have. In this way, you can discuss the truth of such an idea in your own life or experience, using the poems and the story you have chosen to supplement and bolster your discussion. Your essay should be a minimum of 750 words, and as usual, you should expect to go over it with me in conference after your initial submission next week, so that, in other words, what you're submitting is a draft. It should be your second draft, not your first. And so that should do it, and we'll continue on. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this today. I hope you have too, and good luck with your essay.